Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. In today's video, it's the next in my series of videos following the talk I did at the Nordic Integration Summit. Today we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive trying to understand the costs for Azure Service Bus. So let's start off with a quick look at the table in the Azure pricing documentation. So the first thing to note is we've got different SKUs for Service Bus here. And they kind of work in different ways, and each SKU has different features available. So as a pure entry-level feature, we have basic service bus. And from a cost perspective, here it's completely consumption-based. So the more messages you send, the more messages you receive, the more you would pay. So the costs here are based around a messaging operation, which would be things like checking for an event, sending a message, receiving a message, and you would pay a small amount of money per million operations. So that's a pretty good cost there. The key thing to probably note is there's some big differences between the different SKUs, particularly on basic, where there's a lot of the features that you might want for an enterprise message broker that are kind of restricted. So it's a very cut down version of Service Bus, but then it's a great price for it. With standard, it's probably the most difficult to calculate your costs because there's, with premium and basic, there's only really one parameter that pretty much comes into play. With standard, there's multiple. So the first thing to note is you've got this basic charge here, which is a per hour charge. Now it's pretty small, but I think for a month you're typically going to be looking at about $10 for a Service Bus namespace, and that'll give you an inclusive 13 million operations per month. But then if you go beyond that 13 million, you've got a sort of a band of number of operations that you would be charged appropriately. So as an example, the next 87 million operations, you pay 80 cents per million. So it's again pretty cheap, but that obviously scales as you use it more. Now the premium service bus, you can see here you're paying nearly $1 an hour. So that's significantly more expensive just at an initial glance compared to the other options. But with premium, you've got a number of advanced features such as dedicated infrastructure, and you've got a whole bunch of other things. You'll get committed throughput compared to the others, and there's some other more advanced features, bigger messages and stuff. Now, the question that you really have to think about is which is the right SKU for you when you start. Now, in today's video, what we're going to do is take a look at the costs that have been associated with a few different environments and what they would look like depending on what you're doing with Service Bus. We'll get a flavour of what that looks like in the real world. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of talk through some of the different things I would be thinking about from a cost perspective when using Service Bus. So the first thing we've got is an example where I've got an environment with premium and standard service buses. So in this case, I've got a graph showing me the cost per resource. So the key thing to note is here, these are both of the premium namespaces. So we've got pretty big cost for each of them per day. And what you'd notice straight away is you can't really see the cost for the standard one by comparison. It's so small. Even though there is quite a bit of usage on them, it's just not even remotely close to the potential usage of premium. So that the costs in some cases can be significantly different, especially when you're not really hitting the thresholds of when they start becoming like for like. But if we go and dig a little bit deeper into that, you would see, if we look in this same scenario, we look at the meters. So the meter for the premium namespace, so this is showing basically both combined. So the premium namespace is charged per messaging unit, and that's for two different namespaces in this case, so it's pretty high cost. But the standard namespaces, you're really paying that per messaging operation, and you can see those namespaces by comparison are really, really small. Now we're looking at another scenario where we've got two different types of service bus. So we've got basic and standard here. So you can see we've got the standard base unit here, which is one of the metrics showing up for the standard ones. That's fairly consistent cost. And I think this is one of the big things a basic SKU is going to be really volatile based on the number of messages, but for certainly for premium, it's going to be fairly consistent, much more predictable cost. Standard's kind of somewhere in the middle, where if you're using it below the threshold, it'll be very predictable, and if you cross that threshold, it'll become more volatile. So you can see here, for example, the blue is the standard base unit, but the little sort of greeny colour there, that's actually the message on operations, where we must have went beyond that threshold on a couple of days. So we've got this little extra spike in cost. And then, although it's quite a small use case for basic here, you can see, it's kind of changing a bit each day because it's all based on the number of messages being processed. Sorry, skipping ahead there. Now, what I like to do in the videos is we'll think about two things. So what are the considerations and design decisions that I'm thinking about when I use Service Bus in my solution? Then we'll also talk about some of the optimization techniques we can use. So the first question is, do I actually need Service Bus? That's kind of key question number one. So where are we using Service Bus is going to be scenarios where we need some kind of message broker. And there's really a couple of cases here. So the first one would be if I'm doing something like in-application messaging, I'm not really crossing any application boundaries. I just need somewhere to store a message, pick it up, and then process it out of band. So I'm probably not going to use a huge amount of those enterprise message broker-like features. I just need a little bit of asynchronousness to my solution. So that might be a good case where a storage queue could do instead. And I think a good example of that is, I think with things like logic apps, if we think of the logic app runtime, the logic app runtime doesn't have a dependency for its internal async worker process on Service Bus. It's actually using storage queues as one of the mechanisms behind the scenes about how it's processing its data. So that's a good example of a use case where storage is pretty cheap. They only need some of the kind of fairly basic features that offers to know what order am I processing my messages in. Now, obviously, there's more to logic apps about the state and picking it up, but it's really much more like a work queue, and that's similar to how you might use it in your application. But for people who need scenarios where you've certainly crossing a system boundary, so I'm passing a message from one application to another, that would definitely be a case where I'd be much better off with a Service Bus. But then I've got patterns like, publish, subscribe. I need duplicate detection. I need, more advanced retry mechanisms, scheduled messages, those kind of things. They quickly move me away from a storage queue to a proper Service Bus. So that's really some high-level thinking on that. But if you are in the position you do definitely need Service Bus, the next question is, how many services buses do I actually need? Now, thinking about the different customers I've seen over the years, sometimes you have people where they'll only want one single namespace. Sometimes you'll have people where they have loads of different namespaces, and I think there's definitely a balance that you would need. So, firstly, the more premium namespaces you have, definitely the fewer that you want because of the significant cost for each one. But then if you've got the smaller standard namespaces, they're a lot cheaper, so it's much more feasible to have multiple. And I think there's just a question of, how are you going to manage that as a shared resource? Does it make sense for your architecture? Is it part of your integration platform? Is it part of an application itself? And there's a bunch of thinking you would need to do there. But I think the key thing is, don't go too overboard having too many namespaces, because what will often happen is you'll end up having ones that no longer get used and they're just lying around as waste, spending a little bit of money, but you're not actually using them anymore. So I've seen that a few times. Now, probably the biggest decision you're going to make with Service Bus is which SKU do you need. So we've got these choices for basic, standard, and premium. And there's actually quite a bit of thinking needs to go into this about which one you would actually choose. So, if we think about, which SKU do I want? So we said earlier the basic one was a very cut down version of Service Bus, really aimed at simple messaging. You sacrifice a few features to get a cheaper price. Standard would give you most of the more advanced features, and you're going to pay a little bit more for that. But then premium's going to give you things like predictable infrastructure. You'll avoid noisy neighbours. You're going to get scenarios for disaster recovery and replication and that kind of thing that start coming into play. You're going to have bigger message support, things like JMS support, and those really would push you towards premium. I think probably one of the most common things that helps people choose between standard and premium for a lot of customers is going to be the VNet support. So we mentioned this down here. If you need to integrate your service bus with a network so it's private, that really pushes you to the premium option. Now, I think we've talked about message size and JMS support as well a little bit there. So really, it's important, when you make that first decision, look through all the different features that are available on each one and help make the decision. I think it's going to be quite awkward. The more integrations and applications you've got connected to Service Bus, the more difficult it would be to change that later on. There's not an easy. I think you can probably upgrade to premium, but shifting back down is not going to be something easy to do. Now, assuming you pick premium, the next question you've got is how many units do I need? So they have this concept of a messaging unit, which I guess under the hood, the simplest way to think of it is how many servers do you need in your premium namespace to be able to deal with the capacity that you're going to need. So you want throughput, you want volume of messages, you want, you need capacity to deal with the load you're going to have. So there's going to be a bit of monitoring to do there, a bit of testing to figure out what's going to be the right level of service bus to get the correct sustainable throughput you need for your scenarios. Now, there are some rules in service bus, so we can have a look at the next slide. Shows the scale option on a premium service bus, so it's quite interesting here. We've got auto scale and manual scale, so you can see down here on the manual scale option, I can just change the drop down to choose how many messaging units that I want. So if I want 3, 4 to get more volume of messaging going on, then it's really easy for me to do that. Now that's a fantastic option for a platform as a service where I can just scale it, scale it out really easy just by changing the drop down list, which is brilliant. The auto scale does let me configure some rules so I can make it inflate and deflate based on some metrics, which is really good as well. Now, the next thing to think about is, and I think this will become a much bigger thing moving forward in the future because of this preview feature, but customers who need to think about what's their DR strategy going to be, I think are going to push much more towards the premium namespace because of these couple of features. So that there's a subtle difference between each one. Geo disaster recovery basically means I'm going to pair 2 namespaces, and then it's going to copy the metadata, so things like what queues and topics have I got in my namespace. It's going to replicate them to the second namespace, with the idea in a DR scenario I can flip the kind of flip the name to the second namespace, so my applications will still be able to connect, but we'll just move from one region to another. Now that's pretty cool if it makes it really easy for us to do sort of an active passive kind of standby namespace. I guess the first thing is obviously a premium namespace is quite expensive, so that's going to be sat around not really doing anything, and it's going to cost me money for that. But then when I need that quick, recovery time, I've got an RTO that's pretty aggressive. That's a great way for me to be able to do that. Now, the one key point to note with geo disaster recovery is it's only the metadata. It's not the actual messages that get replicated. Now, the preview feature geo replication is the next step. So that's in addition to copying the metadata, that's going to replicate the messages themselves to that secondary namespace, which to me is a really huge feature. And if we think how difficult it would be if particularly back when we used to use on-premise message brokers, to have a message broker that replicates all the data to different data centers, It was a pretty significant infrastructure effort and application level effort to support that. Now we just click a button and we pretty much get that. Now we do have to obviously pay for the second namespace, and there will be a charge for the bandwidth for data being replicated across region. But actually, for those customers that need that capability, it's going to be a really great way to get that. And really, for me, that really validates the cost of the premium namespace to hit those extra resiliencies in the solution. I think is a good one. Now, going beyond some of the things that I would be thinking about when I'm trying to decide what do I want to do with Service Bus, there's also some optimizations that I need to make. So the first one would be login. So when you turn on login for your namespace in the diagnostic settings, it's going to push out quite a bit of data. So you need to be careful about when you use that. Some people might be using it for security scenarios. You might be putting it into log analytics or something like that. So just be cautious about how much data you're going to be logging, because that isn't going to show up as a service bus cost. It's going to show up as some kind of login cost on the workspace for log analytics, possibly. And if you're pushing out mountains of data in there, that's going to get expensive really quickly. So just be cautious about that. The next optimization would be the claim check pattern. So this is not a configuration of Service Bus, more so it's a design pattern of how you're going to use it. So the idea here is, let's say I've got a message that's 30 meg and I want to pass it from my sender to my receiver through Service Bus. So option one would be use the premium namespace, because I can push up to 100 meg as a message. Now that's pretty cool. The key thing is that I'm going to pay a lot more money for that, and if I'm not doing a lot of other messaging that justifies the rest of the features that premium has, if I'm really only doing a very lightweight scenario, that's a very expensive way to solve that problem. So an alternative way with a standard namespace would be that I'd save the message body into storage. I'd then put a message on the queue saying, here's where the message payload is in the storage account, and almost like the message on Service Bus is a pointer to the real body. And the receiver would then get that, pick the message up, and then proceed from there. So that could save me a lot of money by keeping me on the standard plan. So it's a good pattern to keep in mind for Service Bus. The next one is things like batching and prefetch. So the more, if you think about, I'm going to send 1 million messages to Service Bus. If I send each message one at a time, then I'm going to have 1 million Service Bus operations for those 1 million messages. Now, if I can do them in batches, that might reduce the operations significantly. So if I do them in batches of 100, straight away I get down from 1 million to 10,000 operations, which is, it's a pretty significant reduction. And especially if I'm on something like a Service Bus standard namespace, that can be a good cost saving by sending messages in batches. Now, obviously, it depends on the application scenario. Not every application would suit batching very well, but if you can use it, it's a good way to reduce those operations. Likewise, things like on the receiver side, if you can prefetch multiple messages in a batch and then process them, you're reducing the number of times you go back to Service Bus to pick a message up. So again, you can have a good cost saving there. So batching and prefetch are really pretty easy ways as well. Particularly prefetch, I think, is an easy way to just tune your config settings and reduce some of the load on Service Bus to save you some money. Next one is the auto scale out. So here we talked a little bit about the rules before. We definitely want to be thinking about on premium, when would we use that scale out, and that can definitely save us some money. We don't want to stay with 2 or 3 nodes all the time when we're not doing much. We can deflate back to 1 maybe. And then the final thing I want to talk about is connection multiplexing. So this is a way where you can create a single connection to Service Bus that can be reused by multiple different senders at the same time inside your application. So there's a couple of good things here. So number one, that single connection might reduce the amount of overall connections that you have to Service Bus. So each, typically a standard namespace, for example, will have a limit on how many concurrent connections that you can have. And if you can reuse a connection within an application, it's going to limit how many actual overall connections, which would limit when you would hit a throttling kind of condition, or you'd have to think about alternative patterns or possibly upgrade to premium. So that connection can be reused, and you can have multiple people send messages at the same time down the same connection, which is really cool. I think the last thing I want to talk about is we've been doing a bit of work on a playbook here. So this playbook is this is the Azure Cost Management Playbook. You might be able to see up the top here, and we've got quite a lot of info here about things like factors affecting the cost for Service Bus, and also a bunch of different resources. And as I kind of scroll down the page here, what I've been trying to do is, beyond these videos, just capture a lot of my thinking behind this this presentation. So, going into more detail about some of the details of the Service Bus, some of the options, some of the common optimizations that you might use. So hopefully this is a great resource for people who want to just dig a bit deeper and think about how do I best get value for money from Service Bus. Thank you for listening to today's video. I hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great week.